Calder Hawthorne stared at the slow drip of coffee pooling into his mug, his hands resting heavily on the countertop. The kitchen, usually a sanctuary of morning routine, felt eerily still. Lenora sat at the table, her untouched glass of wine catching the light. She never drank before sundown. Tonight it was as though the rules of their life had quietly unraveled. "Calder, sit down. We need to talk." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she smoothed the edges of the placemat in front of her. He obliged, the scrape of the chair against the floor breaking the silence. Something gnawed at the back of his mind, a sensation he couldn't yet name. "What's going on, Lenora?" She looked down, her dark eyes fixed on the thin rim of her glass. "You've felt it too, haven't you? The distance between us. It's been there for months." Calder opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. She wasn't wrong. The long nights, the hollow exchanges, the absence of her warmth in their shared bed. They'd become fixtures in a life that once felt unshakable. He'd told himself it was stress, that they'd find their way back. Now the weight in her voice told him otherwise. "I need time," she continued, her tone soft but resolute. "Time to figure out what's wrong. Time to decide if we can still work." The words hit Calder like a cold wind, sharp and merciless. "Time?" he repeated, his voice rising. "Lenora, we've been married for over a decade. You don't just walk out and call it time." She flinched but held her ground. "It's not about walking out. It's about figuring out who I am outside of this us." He stared at her, his mind scrambling to make sense of it. "What does that even mean? Did I do something? Did I not do enough?" "No, Calder, that's just it. This isn't about you, not entirely. It's about me, and I don't even know how to explain it." Her eyes glistened, but she blinked back tears. "I've already packed a few things. Elias is staying with my sister tonight. I'll pick him up tomorrow." His heart sank. "You're leaving? For now, it's not forever. I just need space." She reached across the table, her hand hovering over his for a moment before retreating. "I'll call. We'll talk." The door closed behind her with a finality that echoed through the house. Calder sat in stunned silence, his mind replaying every word, every gesture. He wanted to rage, to demand answers, to tell her she couldn't just walk away. Instead, he found himself unable to move, as though her absence had drained the energy from his body. The hours ticked by, and Calder found himself pacing the length of their living room. The evidence of her departure was everywhere. The empty hook where her coat usually hung, the soft indentation on the couch where she'd sat before leaving. He ran a hand through his hair, gripping it tightly as frustration boiled inside him. What was she looking for? What did space mean when they'd built their entire lives together? Calder grabbed his phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing her number. It went straight to voicemail. He stared at the screen, the faint glimmer of hope dimming. This wasn't how he imagined their story would unravel. By the time the sun began to rise, Calder had convinced himself that she'd come to her senses. She loved him. She'd said as much. Surely this was just a rough patch, a temporary misstep. But as the days stretched into weeks, he'd come to realize that Lenora's absence was more than physical. It was a chasm growing wider with every unanswered question. Calder Hawthorne sat at the edge of his bed, the weight of Lenora's absence pressing down like an anchor. The room felt alien without her scattered presence, the faint scent of her perfume on the pillow or the hum of her hairdryer in the mornings. Days had passed since she left, but the silence was more deafening than her words that night. He had tried to push through, focusing on Elias and his engineering projects at work, yet whispers crept into his life, subtle and insidious. It started with passing comments from well-meaning neighbors, their voices laced with careful hesitation. "She's been seen around town," one had said, their tone light but carrying the weight of implication. "She's spending a lot of time with someone from the school," another added, their gaze a mix of pity and reluctance. Calder dismissed them at first. Small-town gossip had a way of turning every absence into scandal. Lenora wouldn't. She couldn't. The thought felt almost absurd. But as the murmurs grew louder and the stories more detailed, doubt began to take root. That evening, Calder invited his closest friend, Cyril Vandenberg, over for dinner. If anyone could help him navigate this turmoil, it was Cyril. Over plates of barely touched lasagna, Calder finally broke his silence. "Have you heard anything about Lenora?" His voice was measured, but his hands betrayed his nerves, fidgeting with the edge of his glass. Cyril hesitated, his fork hovering mid-air. "Why do you ask?" "I've been hearing things," Calder admitted, his gaze dropping to his plate. "People are talking, saying she's seeing someone." There was a long pause, the kind that stretched and twisted the air. Cyril finally sighed, setting his fork down. "Calder, you know how people are in this town. They'll twist anything into a story." "Then tell me it's not true," Calder pressed, his voice sharp with desperation. Cyril hesitated again, and that was all Calder needed. The silence spoke louder than any confirmation. His chest tightened, a knot of anger and betrayal forming. "She is, isn't she?" Calder whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know for sure," Cyril replied carefully, "but I've heard things too, about a guy named Brandon Lowell. He works with her at the school." Calder leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. The name meant nothing to him, but the implications were everything. Brandon Lowell, a real person, a tangible betrayal. "She said she needed space," Calder murmured, bitterness seeping into his words. "Not another man." Cyril shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he could offer some reassurance. "Look, maybe it's not what it seems. Maybe she's just confused." Confused. The word felt like an insult. Lenora wasn't the type to stumble into confusion. Every step she took was deliberate, calculated. If she was spending time with Brandon, it wasn't an accident. That night, Calder lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts raced, each one more damning than the last. Images of Lenora with this Brandon played in his mind, vivid and tormenting. He tried to push them away, but they clung to him, a cruel echo of the whispers he'd heard. The next morning, Calder decided he couldn't live in the shadows of uncertainty. He needed answers. He needed proof. After dropping Elias off at school, Calder found himself parked outside a small private office with frosted glass windows and the bold lettering, Blue Ridge Investigations. Inside, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor greeted him. Calder explained his situation, the details spilling out faster than he'd intended. The man listened, taking notes, his expression unreadable. "We'll find out the truth," the investigator assured him. "Give me a week." Calder nodded, the knot in his chest loosening ever so slightly. Truth. That was all he wanted. But as he drove home, a darker thought took hold. What if the truth wasn't what he wanted to hear? The call came earlier than Calder had expected. A low, gravelly voice on the other end of the line informed him the report was ready. His stomach knotted, and his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove to the investigator's office. The truth was waiting, sealed in an envelope. But Calder wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. Blue Ridge Investigations was a modest, unassuming building. The investigator, Miles Foster, met him with a curt nod, handing over a slim manila folder. "It's all in here," Miles said, his tone professional, yet tinged with sympathy. "Let me know if you have questions." Calder stared at the folder for a moment before nodding. "Thanks," he murmured, his voice hollow. He left without opening it, the weight of the folder burning a hole in the passenger seat as he drove home. When he finally sat down at the kitchen table, he hesitated. The house was quiet. Elias was at school, and yet Calder could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He slid a finger under the flap of the envelope, pulling out a series of photographs and typed pages. The first photo hit him like a punch to the gut. Lenora, her unmistakable silhouette sitting across from a man in an outdoor cafe. She was smiling, an expression Calder hadn't seen in months. The man, presumably Brandon Lowell, leaned forward, his hand resting casually on the table, close enough to brush hers. Page after page detailed their interactions, lunches at discreet locations, weekend trips that coincided with her visits to her sister, and long evenings at his modest rental on the outskirts of town. The timeline stretched back over a year, long before Lenora had mentioned the distance in their marriage. Calder slammed the folder shut, his chest heaving. He stood, pacing the kitchen, his thoughts spiraling into chaos. This wasn't just betrayal, it was premeditated. Every kind word, every reassuring touch in those months now felt like a calculated lie. He wanted to scream, to break something, but instead he sat back down, forcing himself to open the folder again. He needed to know everything. There were receipts, time-stamped photographs, and even details about Brandon. A divorced history teacher at Lenora's school, Brandon was unremarkable in every way. No wealth, no charm Calder could discern from the photographs, just a quiet, unassuming man who had somehow stolen what Calder had worked a decade to build. By the time Calder closed the folder for good, it felt as though something inside him had snapped. He wasn't just angry, he was humiliated. Lenora hadn't even tried to hide it well. Did she think he was blind, or did she simply not care enough to bother? That evening, Calder sat on the back porch, a beer in hand, staring at the horizon. The sun dipped low, casting a warm orange glow that felt entirely out of place against the storm brewing in his chest. Cyril had been right to hesitate, but Calder couldn't bring himself to blame his friend. This wasn't about anyone else. It was about Lenora, the woman he'd built his life around, who had slowly, deliberately dismantled it. The next morning, Calder woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in weeks. He wasn't going to let Lenora or Brandon control the narrative of his life. He called Miles back, requesting digital copies of everything in the report. "Are you sure you want to keep all this?" Miles asked, his tone cautious. "I'm sure," Calder replied. "This isn't over." As he hung up, Calder felt a grim sense of purpose. The photographs and evidence weren't just for him. They were ammunition, a shield against the storm he was preparing to unleash. If Lenora thought she could walk away unscathed, she was sorely mistaken. Calder Hawthorne stood in the dim light of his garage, the digital copies of the investigator's report laid out neatly on the workbench before him. Each photograph, every receipt, each damning timestamp felt like a weapon. He stared at them, letting the full weight of their implications settle in. His mind wasn't clouded by rage anymore. This was something else. Cold calculation. The first step was financial. Calder had always been meticulous about their shared accounts. He knew every balance, every credit limit, and every bill due. Lenora had left their joint accounts untouched, perhaps to maintain the illusion that her separation was merely temporary. She hadn't expected him to act preemptively. He opened his laptop and logged into their bank accounts. Methodically, he began shifting funds, savings into his personal account, checking into a newly opened account she didn't know existed. He transferred small amounts at a time, careful not to trigger any immediate suspicions. She wouldn't notice, not yet. Then there was the line of credit tied to their home. It had been sitting dormant since they'd paid off the last renovation. Calder reviewed the terms carefully before requesting the maximum withdrawal. It wasn't theft, he reminded himself. The house was as much his as it was hers, and he wasn't about to leave her with an advantage. Satisfied with the progress, Calder turned his attention to their belongings. He moved quickly, sorting through valuables and personal items that meant something to him. Documents, heirlooms, and keepsakes were boxed and discreetly transported to a rented storage unit. If Lenora wanted to burn their life to the ground, she'd have to do it without him. His thoughts circled back to the man who had infiltrated his marriage, Brandon Lowell. The investigator's report had revealed more than just dates and locations. It painted a picture of a man who was painfully ordinary, a stark contrast to the life Calder had provided Lenora. Why him? Calder wondered. What did he offer that Calder didn't? That night, Calder found himself standing in their bedroom, staring at the empty side of the bed. His fists clenched at the memory of Lenora's dismissive tone when she'd asked for space. Space, as it turned out, was just another word for betrayal. A new thought crept into his mind, one he hadn't entertained before. What if this wasn't just about Brandon? What if Lenora had planned everything? The separation? The gradual distance? It all felt too deliberate. Was he simply a backup plan in case her new life didn't work out? Calder knew he couldn't confront her directly. Not yet. The evidence in his possession wasn't just for his own clarity, it was his leverage. He needed to stay one step ahead to make sure that when the time came, she wouldn't have the chance to turn the tables. Over the next week, Calder continued to execute his plan. He used her credit card sparingly but strategically. Expensive dinners, electronics, and even a fishing trip he'd never actually take were all billed to her name. Each purchase felt like a small victory, a way to reclaim a piece of what she had taken from him. When Lenora called, as she did every few days to check in, Calder played his role perfectly. His voice was calm, even warm, as though he hadn't just spent hours dismantling the life they'd built together. "How's Elias?" she asked one evening, her tone light, almost casual. "He's good," Calder replied, keeping his answers brief. "He misses you, though." There was a pause. "I miss him too," she said softly. "And you?" Calder's grip tightened around the phone. "Do you?" he asked, his voice steady. "Of course," she replied. "I just need more time." "More time?" Calder almost laughed. She had no idea that her time was running out. As he hung up the phone, Calder felt a grim satisfaction. The pieces were falling into place, and Lenora was blissfully unaware. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was in control. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about survival. The evening felt heavy, laden with an ominous tension Calder couldn't quite shake. He had been invited to dinner at Cyril and Marietta Vandenberg's house, a rare reprieve from the chaos of his unraveling life. Yet as he drove along the winding road to their quiet home, he couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in his chest. Cyril greeted him at the door with a familiar warmth, ushering him inside where the smell of roasted chicken filled the air. Marietta, ever the gracious hostess, handed Calder a glass of wine before sitting across from him at the dining table. Their kindness felt like a balm, but it also struck a chord of bitterness. Everyone around him seemed to know more about his life than he did, their silences speaking volumes. As the conversation drifted to mundane topics, Calder felt the weight of his suspicions bubble to the surface. "So," he began, his voice steady but probing, "have either of you heard from Lenora?" Marietta's hand paused mid-reach for her glass, her smile faltering for just a moment. Cyril shot her a quick glance, one Calder didn't miss. The tension between them was palpable, and Calder's heart sank. "Why do you ask?" Cyril finally said, his tone carefully neutral. Calder set his glass down, leaning forward slightly. "Because I keep hearing things I can't ignore anymore. If you know something, Cyril, I need you to tell me." Marietta's eyes darted to Cyril, silently pleading with him. But Cyril sighed, setting down his fork. "Calder, we didn't want to be the ones to tell you. We thought Lenora would come clean herself." "Tell me what?" Calder's voice was sharp, each word a demand. Cyril hesitated before finally speaking. "The rumors, they're true. She's with Brandon Lowell." It felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. Calder's fingers curled into fists, his knuckles whitening as he fought to maintain his composure. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Not long," Cyril admitted, though his tone lacked conviction. "We thought it was just a phase, something she'd regret and end before it went too far." Marietta chimed in, her voice soft. "Calder, we didn't know how to tell you. You've always loved her so much. We didn't want to hurt you." "You didn't want to hurt me?" Calder's laughter was bitter, cutting through the quiet. "You didn't think watching me sit in the dark, clueless, while everyone whispered behind my back was worse?" "That's not fair," Cyril said defensively. "We were trying to protect you." Calder stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Protect me?" he repeated, his voice rising. "The only thing you protected was her lie." "Calder, wait!" Marietta started, but he was already moving toward the door. He drove home in silence, his mind a storm of anger and betrayal. Cyril and Marietta, people he had considered his closest friends, had been complicit in keeping the truth from him. The betrayal stung almost as much as Lenora's. Who else had known? Who else had stood by, watching him unravel while pretending to care? By the time Calder reached his house, his anger had crystallized into something colder. He wouldn't rely on anyone else for answers. If Cyril and Marietta couldn't be trusted, he'd handle this himself. He poured himself a stiff drink, sitting at the kitchen table where Lenora had once broken his world apart. The investigator's report lay in a neat pile at the edge of the table, waiting. Calder picked it up, his jaw tightening as he flipped through the pages once more. If Lenora and Brandon thought they could rewrite his life without consequence, they were wrong. He'd let them believe they were safe, that he was still the clueless, desperate husband she had walked away from. But now he knew the truth, and he wouldn't let it destroy him. Calder sat in his car, parked just outside the modest brick school building where Lenora worked. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he watched staff filter out at the end of the day. It wasn't a coincidence he had chosen this moment. Timing was everything. He wasn't here to confront her, at least not yet. This was reconnaissance, a subtle maneuver in the war he had only just begun to wage. Lenora emerged, her stride purposeful but casual, as though she carried no weight of guilt. Calder's jaw tightened as he noticed Brandon Lowell waiting for her by the school's side door. They exchanged a brief smile, an unspoken connection passing between them. It was small, subtle, but Calder saw it clearly, and it stoked the fire smoldering in his chest. He forced himself to breathe deeply. Acting on impulse was not an option. Instead, Calder turned the key in the ignition and drove away, the image of their interaction seared into his mind. He wasn't going to confront her here. Not yet. The battlefield had to be of his choosing. That evening, Lenora called as she always did, her voice carrying the same practiced warmth. "How are you, Calder?" she asked. "Fine," he replied, his tone measured. "Elias is doing well. He had a good day at school." "That's great to hear," she said softly. "I miss him, you know." "I know," Calder said, letting a pause stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. "Do you miss me?" There was a beat of silence. "Of course I do," she finally said. I need more time to figure things out." "Take all the time you need," Calder replied smoothly, the edge in his voice carefully masked. "I want you to be sure of what you want." Her relief was almost audible. "Thank you for understanding," she said. He hung up shortly after, his lips curling into a grim smile. Lenora had no idea he was no longer the man she had left. He wasn't begging for her return, wasn't holding on to hope. No, he was strategizing. And her every word, every pause was ammunition. The next step in his plan required precision. Over the following weeks, Calder worked to create the appearance of normalcy. He attended neighborhood gatherings, brought Elias to soccer practice, and even accepted invitations from Cyril and Marietta. Every action was deliberate, designed to reinforce the illusion that he was simply a man coping with a challenging time. Behind the scenes, he continued dismantling Lenora's financial safety net. Her credit cards were maxed out with strategic purchases, a high-end laptop here, an extravagant set of golf clubs there. He even used her card to make a donation to a local animal shelter in her name, knowing it would appear on her statements but provide no leverage against him. When Lenora visited one weekend to see Elias, Calder played his role flawlessly. He greeted her with warmth, offered her coffee, and engaged in polite conversation. Yet every word he spoke, every movement he made was calculated. He observed her closely, noting how she avoided eye contact when she asked about his well-being, how she hesitated when he brought up the possibility of reconciliation. "I just want us to be happy again," Calder said at one point, his voice sincere enough to make her falter. "I do too," Lenora replied, though her tone lacked conviction. "It's just complicated." Calder had heard enough. As Lenora left that afternoon, he watched her walk down the driveway, her shoulders slightly hunched as though she carried a burden she refused to name. He knew then that the psychological game was working. She was beginning to crack. That night, Calder opened the investigator's report once more, reviewing every detail. He wasn't just preparing for a confrontation, he was ensuring victory. He would take control of the narrative, leaving Lenora with no choice but to face the consequences of her betrayal. For now, he let her believe she still held the upper hand. But in reality, Calder was already several moves ahead, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The call came just after midnight. Calder had been sitting in the darkened living room, staring at the muted glow of the television, his mind restless. He didn't recognize the number flashing on his phone screen, but something told him to answer. "Hello? Mr. Hawthorne?" The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "This is Officer McKeon with the Blue Ridge Police Department. We're calling regarding an incident involving Brandon Lowell. Do you have a moment to speak? Calder's grip on the phone tightened. What happened? He was attacked outside his residence earlier tonight. He's in critical condition at St. Mary's Hospital. We're contacting close acquaintances and gathering information. We understand you may know his partner, Lenora Whitfield. For a moment, Calder's mind went blank. The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. I'm not sure how I can help. We're simply confirming any potential connections, the officer said. We may need to follow up later. Thank you for your time. The call ended, leaving Calder sitting in stunned silence. His first instinct wasn't concern for Brandon, it was curiosity. Who had done this, and why? By morning, the news had spread across town. Brandon had been brutally beaten, left with multiple fractures and internal injuries. No suspects had been identified, but the rumors were already flying. Some whispered it was a random mugging. Others speculated it was someone with a personal vendetta. Calder couldn't shake the feeling that Lenora was now teetering on the edge. This wasn't part of his plan, but it created an opportunity. He decided to make his next move. That evening, Lenora called, her voice fraught with panic. "Calder, have you heard? It's Brandon. He's in the hospital." "I heard," Calder replied, his tone deliberately neutral. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," she said, her voice breaking. "It's just, I don't understand why someone would do this." He let her unravel for a moment, her words tumbling out in disjointed fragments. Then, with carefully measured calm, he said, "Maybe it's time to rethink everything, Lenora. This separation, your choices. Do you really know the people you've surrounded yourself with?" Her silence was telling. Calder leaned into it, his voice soft but firm. "Sometimes, the decisions we make have consequences we don't see coming. You should be careful, Lenora." "Are you blaming me for this?" she snapped, her panic giving way to anger. "Not at all," Calder said smoothly. "But maybe it's time you come home. For Elias? For us?" Her breath hitched. "I can't just—" "You can," he interrupted, "if you really want to." The line went quiet, and for a moment Calder wondered if he had pushed too far. Then she whispered, "I'll think about it." As he hung up, Calder felt a surge of satisfaction. The seeds of doubt were planted. Lenora wasn't just questioning her choices, she was questioning her safety. He didn't need to lift a finger to dismantle her world. It was already crumbling under its own weight. The next day, Calder visited Cyril and Marietta, needing a reprieve from the tension. Over drinks, Cyril broached the subject. "Have you heard about Brandon?" "Hard to miss," Calder replied, keeping his tone light. Cyril leaned forward, lowering his voice. Do you think someone did this because of Lenora?" "It's possible," Calder said, shrugging. "She's made some interesting choices." Marietta shot him a sharp look. "Calder, you wouldn't—" "Of course not," he said, cutting her off. "But if Lenora keeps walking the line she's on, this might just be the beginning." That night, as Calder sat alone once more, he replayed the day's events in his mind. The chaos swirling around Brandon and Lenora was growing, and Calder was content to watch it unfold. He didn't need to control every piece of the puzzle, he just needed to ensure that in the end he was the one left standing. Lenora Whitfield sat in her car outside the modest suburban courthouse, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The official-looking envelope in her passenger seat contained papers she never thought she'd receive. Papers that spelled out the end of everything she had once taken for granted. Calder had filed for divorce. She didn't open them right away. The idea of seeing in black and white the dissolution of their decade-long marriage felt like a knife to her chest. She had told herself she was in control, that she had carefully orchestrated her next steps, but now it was clear. She wasn't steering the ship anymore. Calder was. Inside the courthouse, she sat across from her attorney, a man she'd hired hastily when the situation had spiraled beyond her grasp. He looked at her over his glasses, his tone clipped and professional. "Your husband has made a strategic play," he said, sliding a document across the table. "He's citing irreconcilable differences, but the financial moves he's made suggest he's been planning this for months." Lenora skimmed the document, her stomach twisting as she read. Calder had liquidated their savings accounts, withdrawn from the home's line of credit, and left her saddled with credit card debts she hadn't even realized existed. Her name was on all of it. "This can't be right," she murmured, her voice trembling. "He wouldn't do this." The attorney's expression didn't soften. "He already has. If you'd like to contest this, it's going to be a long, expensive fight." Expensive? The word echoed in her mind, louder than the others. Her modest salary as a guidance counselor wasn't enough to cover her mounting debts, let alone the legal fees she'd need to battle Calder. And Brandon? Brandon was gone. After the attack, he had pulled away, retreating into his own recovery and distancing himself from the chaos Lenora's life had become. She was alone. That realization hit her like a wave, and for the first time in months, the confidence she had clung to began to crack. The choices she had made, the affair, the separation, the lies, had led her here to this exact moment where everything was slipping through her fingers. "Do I have any options?" she asked quietly, her voice almost pleading. The attorney sighed. "You can settle. Take what you can and walk away before this gets worse." That evening, Lenora returned to the house she once called home. The walls, once filled with warmth and laughter, now seemed cold and foreign. Calder was out, and Elias was at a friend's house. She let herself in with the spare key, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. In the living room, she found a stack of envelopes on the table. Most were addressed to her, overdue notices, credit card statements, and bank alerts. She opened them one by one, each one a fresh wound. The debts were staggering, far beyond what she had imagined. She sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. How had it come to this? She had thought she could have it all, a new romance, the freedom to find herself, and the security of knowing Calder would always be there as a safety net. But Calder wasn't the man she had left. He had outmaneuvered her at every turn, leaving her with nothing but regret. When Calder returned home later that night, he found her sitting in the darkened living room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she looked up at him, her face pale and drawn. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" Calder's expression was unreadable as he stood in the doorway. "Why?" he repeated, his tone cold. "Because you made your choice, Lenora, and now I'm making mine." Tears welled in her eyes, but Calder didn't move to comfort her. He simply turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the weight of her decisions. For Lenora, the reality was clear. She wasn't just losing her marriage. She was losing everything. And for the first time, she realized there was no one left to blame but herself. The crisp morning air carried a faint promise of change as Calder Hawthorne stood at the edge of his porch, watching Elias chase their neighbor's dog across the front yard. Laughter rang out, clear and unburdened, a sound Calder hadn't realized how much he'd missed. For months, his life had been consumed by bitterness and strategy, every move calculated, every step leading to this point. But now, as he watched his son run free, Calder felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. Inside, Marietta's voice called out, breaking his moment of reflection. "Calder, breakfast is ready." He stepped back into the house, the warmth of the kitchen greeting him like an embrace. Marietta stood by the stove, her hair tied back, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Their mornings together had become routine, a rhythm that felt natural, unforced. She glanced over her shoulder as Calder entered. "Elias will need to come in soon. He has soccer practice later," she reminded him. Calder nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "I'll bring him in. Thanks for making breakfast." She shrugged. "It's nothing. Besides, it's nice having someone to cook for." They exchanged a glance, one filled with unspoken understanding. Their relationship had grown slowly, quietly in the aftermath of everything. Marietta's patience and kindness had been a balm to Calder's weary soul, a stark contrast to the chaos Lenora had left behind. Later that day, Calder found himself at St. Mary's Church, seated in a small, sunlit office across from Father James. The priest had been a quiet confidant during the storm, offering advice without judgment. Today, though, Calder wasn't here to seek guidance. He was here to give thanks. "You seem lighter," Father James remarked, his tone gentle. "I feel lighter," Calder admitted. "For the first time in years, I'm not carrying the weight of what could have been. I've accepted what is." Father James nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "And Lenora?" "She's gone," Calder said, his voice steady. She moved to California last month. I hear she's trying to rebuild her life, but we haven't spoken. I think that's for the best. And you? What are you rebuilding? Calder paused, considering the question. Everything, he said finally. For Elias, for myself, and maybe for Marietta, too. The priest smiled. New beginnings are a gift, Calder. Embrace them. As Calder left the church, his thoughts drifted to Lenora. He didn't wish her harm, but neither did he wish her back. She had made her choices, and Calder had made his. Their lives had diverged, and he had no intention of retracing his steps. That evening, Marietta joined Calder on the porch, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Elias was inside, already asleep after a full day. Marietta leaned against the railing, her shoulder brushing his. "You've been quiet today," she said softly. "Just thinking," he replied. "About how far we've come." She smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "And how far we still have to go." Calder turned to her, his expression serious but warm. "I don't know what the future holds, Marietta, but I know I want you in it." Her smile deepened, and she reached for his hand. "We'll figure it out together." As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Calder felt a sense of closure wash over him. The past was behind him, its shadows no longer dictating his path. For the first time, his steps felt his own, leading him toward a future filled with hope, love, and the quiet strength of starting anew. What do you think of Calder and his journey through betrayal and redemption? From which region are you watching this video? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And don't miss out on more heartwarming tales. Click here on the end screen to watch now.